All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio, folks, in year 17. I guess that means I'm getting old. And folks, I'm very excited to have a real visionary in our field today, someone who has been working on problems of data and data quality and data access for a long time now with a very interesting and innovative company, Excel Data. We have Rohit Chowdhury, co-founder and CEO of Excel Data for our show today, a quality operation using AI to reduce errors. So, Rohit, I'm going to try to explain what you folks do, and you just correct me if I'm wrong. So, Excel Data, you tap into cloud data platforms like Snowflake or Databricks, and you capture metadata. And what you do is you use that metadata to monitor what's happening, to be able to give alerts on things like data quality, like data access, if some all of a sudden data isn't coming through. And you do this as a way to proactively improve data quality, but you also do a bunch of FinOps stuff too, right? Tell us a bit about yourself and Excel Data and the data quality imperative.
Sure, Eric. Thank you so much for having me again. So my name is Rohit. I'm the co-founder and the CEO of Excel Data. The company is at about 6 years old, getting towards six. We have customers across the world, but top customers, some of the top banks, some of the largest telecom companies, some of the largest digital companies, they work with us. And I think, let me just abstract out the problem that we solve for, our customers, and then we can talk about the specifics. I think what has really happened is that data is on many different islands within all enterprises, and these islands are connected by pathways, and those pathways are not all the time open. They get clogged, they have errors, they have accidents, and that makes it really difficult for large enterprises to provide data to marketing, to provide data to advertising, to provide it for operations, and obviously, for financial reporting, forecasting, and all the different kinds of uses that you can think about, that enterprises are putting their data to use. It gets really hard. And I've described this elsewhere as well that when I used to be an application engineer before I became a data engineer, and when I used to be an application engineer, we used to have a lot of access to tools and technologies that would allow us to debug applications and microservices really well. But when I became a data engineer, I found out that none of those tools existed. So data engineers were spending 70 to 80% of their time in just trying to figure out production operations and debug things such as a badly performing query, or data quality not being right, or non-reliable data sets being sent out to business and they were making bad decisions, and a lot of noisy situations in the world. So we help companies solve that problem. Now, if I were to just extend the concept of the data island, because you also referred to FinOps, quality is very, very directly proportional to the cost of the cloud, and the reason is very simple. So if you have bad data quality, you're going to rerun your data pipelines. Data pipelines are nothing but processes that move data from all the way from the source to the point of consumption. And if you have to rerun those data pipelines on the cloud, it's going to be mighty expensive, because today's day and age, you're probably, processing half a petabyte a day in net new data. So it becomes really, really complex and challenging for enterprises to deal with. And those are some of the areas that we help our customers. And this whole new field, sorry about not referring to it, but this whole new field is called data observability. Gartner just put it in a must-have category earlier, in March this year, from a good to have for the last, 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, I've watched the data observability space explode in the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years. And
Yeah.
I have a couple theories on why this happened. One is something called Kubernetes, which came out of Google, of course, and is this amazing containerization orchestration platform that allows you to federate compute, essentially. So instead of the traditional monolithic application that runs through processors, what you do is you carve up the little bits and pieces of functionality and deliver them inside containers, right? It's a brilliant way to deal with scalability, which has been such a challenge for so long. But a sort of side effect of that is that now we have this whole new way of doing things, and there's all this data that can be captured for the purposes that you describe, understanding what's working, what's not working. Is it the did a node go down? Is it the network? I mean, this troubleshooting stuff has always been difficult. And I would argue it's much more difficult now because there's so much more complexity. But that's why we
Yeah.
have this observability phase, right? Is to be able to tap in and maybe talk about how you're able to do that. You, as I understand, you are pulling the metadata, but then you're basically monitoring, is what I'm guessing is happening. You're understanding what a baseline is, what is good, what is something that's supposed to be happening, and then what's different from that. And that's when you get alerts. Is that about right?
Yeah, I think so. Let me just, sort of break it down a little bit. So there are like three different kinds of world. One is essentially your infrastructure and network. And increasingly what we're seeing is that a lot of that is getting abstracted because of the presence of, the cloud players. As far as application deployment is concerned, a lot of that has been taken over by containers. That's been sort of, a liberating technology because you can scale it up, scale it down. So if you're deploying applications, IT applications, which allow you to do certain things, containerization is the best strategy. Now, in addition to that, what has happened is many of these good practices that evolved in the application engineering space, they've also found their way in the data engineering space. But here's the challenge. The challenge is that, you're running notebooks, SQLs, ETL, ELT, batch processing, real-time processing, and several other technologies at the same time, as far as data is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
And data is slightly different than applications that when you are expecting a user to give you an input on a desktop or a mobile screen, you are actually looking for the performance of that particular web page or that particular workflow. In the case of data, the outcome is not immediately known. The outcome is probably known 24 hours later because you've collected all the transaction information as a bank and you're trying to do reconciliation at the end of the day. So these are like very different use cases that we're talking about, from an application or network perspective, all the way from data. The challenge in data is, as more and more people are getting dependent on that, as models start depending upon the data that, is available to them, both in the raw form and also in the harmonized form, it becomes really important that the models are fed the right data. The dashboards that people are using to make decisions. Example, they're deciding to invest in a company or, to place a trade as a day trader. That data has to be highly accurate. The accuracy of that data can go down because, something happened. Somebody changed something upstream manually, or data that was expected to arrive on time did not arrive because, a query stopped performing that day because the volume of data that just came into the enterprise was extremely high. And these are very, very closely correlated concepts and topics, which, people are finding very difficult to, deal with and manage. So I think, that is the field. To your earlier comment, why is this field exploding? The theories, obviously containerization, cloud migration, and proliferation of data centers that or infrastructure is certainly one thing, but I would attribute it to three conditions. One, that data itself is growing exponentially. People are collecting a lot more data from all their IT application, third-party data sources, customer behavior, for all kinds of purposes. The whole world knows about it. The second is that the stack continues to get more and more complex. So the complexity that existed in the data world last year is
Right.
way lower than the
Right.
post AI.
Right.
Now you're
That's right.
And the
That's
third thing
very
is,
funny.
you don't get enough engineers. I wish, we had access to 100 more engineers. We don't. It's really hard to get the
Yeah.
talented engineers. And that introduces, the need for automation and, introduction of concepts that allow people to manage their data systems well. And that's where, data observability comes into play.
Yeah, and let's talk about using AI to monitor these things, right? Pattern recognition. Machine learning is very good at pattern recognition. It's very good at
So,
hacking through very tedious tasks at scale, and that's what we're talking about. So, I kind of mentioned the baseline earlier, and you bring up an excellent point that the stack today is even more complex than it was a year ago or 2 years ago, and theoretically, that complexity level is going to continue to rise. So we're going to have to rely more and more on AI and machine learning to identify patterns and to get very intelligent about alerts, because you also don't want too many alerts. I mean, that's always been the downside of an alerting system, is that where do you set the dial? What is a meaningful alert? What is just something that could be interesting but is not terribly important? Being able to gauge that. Can you talk about how you're able to do that, and what sort of technologies are in play there?
yeah, so I think there's a shift in data management overall, and it's also reflecting in the way that people are going about, data reliability and quality. The way that we've gone about the problem is that, certain elements of, management of data from a quality perspective should be completely automated. So back in the day, people had to write rules about, what are the different kinds of checks that they want to conduct on data elements. And it was effective, but effective only to the extent that it was applied for data consumption. The problem with that approach has been that, if you apply it only for data consumption, it's already too late, because what you have done now is that you've allowed bad quality of data percolate through the pipeline, through the various elements of processing, wasted a bunch of money if you're on the cloud, and now you're dealing with the repercussions of bad quality of data, which could lead into, lack of personalization, compliance issues, regulatory faults, all of that. So the way that we, first of all, the approach that we took was, and obviously, before I get into the details of the approach, the second thing is what I mentioned earlier as well, that, now we're dealing with a lot more data than earlier. So if you were talking about gigabytes of data earlier, when data was ready or available for consumption, it's just gone to petabyte scale. And that too, it's rising really rapidly. So the first thing that we did was that we thought, okay, here's a new solution. The new solution is that we're going to shift this entire problem left. And instead of it being, instead of data quality being driven by purely self-serve analytics use cases, we're going to move it back into platform engineering and data engineering, because those are the people who have the capability and the power to actually keep the sanity of data. And if you give them the right tools, if you enable them with the right level of technology, they will be able to do it. Now, obviously, it's a good and noble goal, but it also needs to be assisted with technology. Now, as far as AI is concerned, there are two kinds of models. Obviously, there's like a lot of excitement around generative AI models, but there's also an exceptional, capability that is available today on the non-generative side. And we use both of those, in our products. First of all, the non-generative side, I'll just describe that and I'll come to the generative side. The first thing that we are able to do with the non-generative models is essentially to figure out what the baselines are, where data is anomalous, where data is not fresh, what data sets have been refreshed, what data sets have not been refreshed, what profiles of data should be activated, and where are we seeing anomalies because of changes or radical changes in profiles, but also being automatically able to find out that, the characteristic of this particular data element itself has changed. For example, if there were 50% males and females in a recorded column of a particular table which was being used for targeting, that might have just skewed over a period of time. So all the models that were assuming that 50% male and 50% female data in a particular column, that assumption has now changed. So everybody who's using that column needs to be updated that, look, your fundamental or base assumptions of what data is inside has already changed. Now, obviously, if it has changed over a period of time, a new baseline can be set. So you keep referring to the most recent, numbers or value chain. And then you say, okay, you know what, this is now the net new normal. And we have to work off that baseline as opposed to, an older baseline. The other problem that we also see is that, people use data from applications, and applications have schemas which can keep changing, pretty rapidly. As, IT applications service new use cases, new users, new communities, obviously those elements will change. So the automated change detection on a schema upstream is also equally valuable.
Mm.
The third thing, which is, all the profiling and anomaly detections, those have to be automated. So that's on the non-generative side. And obviously this goes to identifying and classifying, data which is present from different domains. For example, healthcare can be mixed up with customer, can be mixed up with, payment information. The auto classification of all of this information for better data management so that you can scale your data quality program is super important. On the generative side of the world, this is something that we started finding as a breakthrough, as you were referring to earlier, that we collect all the metadata. I'll just describe what metadata we collect. We end up collecting, the performance characteristics, how people are using the data through SQLs and notebooks, how much is that particular compute costing it. And in addition to that, we also have information about what is the structure from a storage standpoint, but also from a change standpoint. And when you put all of that together, it gives you some really, really interesting answers. For example, we are now able to automatically tell you that, this is the 1% of the tables and of the files that are most important to your business because it contains the
Wow.
most important business. Yeah, exactly. I mean, Q4 for us last year has been a year of breakthroughs, and we were like, we shocked ourselves that we were able to predict that these are the only tables that really matter. And from a context perspective, you should just go and create rules for that. But guess what? We changed it from an authoring experience to a stewardship experience that, we've already generated the rules because we knew what had to be tested, what columns are getting, commonly joined, what notebooks are accessing what columns and at what times of the day. So we were able to, figure out what were the rules that had to be written, and we generated those. And then we also generated the schedules. We generated the mechanism by which those alerts should be sent, should those conditions be violated. So it's been a fascinating journey. Now, if you were to just extend this, the power of this whole generation is immense because this automatically lends itself to the tuning on failures. Because if somebody does not like it, you take the feedback loop and you continue to improve your models, which will keep generating better and better data quality rules. Now, if we just abstract out, what's the consequence of this? The biggest problem has been that, CDOs have not been able to scale their data quality program. And the reason was that they could not scale the writing of these data quality rules across databases, across these different data islands. Now, with these generative AI capabilities, you can just scale the program as
Oh,
elastically as you ever.
wow. That's pretty interesting. I was curious to know where the that angle was going to come into play here. Well, folks, don't touch that dial. We're talking to Rohit Chowdhury, co-founder and CEO of Accel Data. That's ACCELDATA, all about data quality and how you can scale data quality programs. And he just made an excellent point that chief data officers, this is a huge challenge for them because they know that a lot needs to be done, but where do you begin? How do you scale? How do you set in process in motion the processes necessary to do that and to keep that going? Because as we've discussed, the environment is getting more complex by the day. How do you basically keep on top of things such that you're not falling behind? Because once you fall behind, that's a very, very unpleasant place to be. You wind up getting errors. Maybe you wind up in some compliance trouble. There are lots of things that can happen that are going to make your day very, very unpleasant. But don't touch that dial, folks. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. Okay, folks, back here on DM Radio with Rohit Chowdhury, co founder and CEO of Accel Data. That's ACCEL data.com. And we're talking about all the amazing things happening in the observability space and what you can do. Rohit, I'm a big fan of cliches. And there's an old cliche that says, when you know better, you do better. And when you know what's happening in your data environment, you're going to do a better job. I mean, half of the challenge in troubleshooting in any tech environment, whether it's IT ops, cloud ops, hybrid cloud ops, half of the challenge is just having the information to know what's actually happening. And then you have to correlate that stuff. You have to kind of put it all together into a meaningful picture of what's actually taking place here that you can address. And you folks seem to be right on the crest of that wave. And you mentioned it in the last segment there how you were able to identify the highest value data in a certain environment and allow an organization to focus on that. Well, I talk about this all the time, and I think about the just outrageous amount of data that we're saving and processing. And it's like there's been this one size fits all process, a cookie cutter process for all data, but all data doesn't matter. I mean, data warehouses were designed to bring in the data that does matter, but even still, you're bringing in absolute mountains of data. Not all of it is going to get used. So being able to see what is getting used by whom, that gets very interesting from a data quality perspective, from a FinOps perspective, from a cost perspective, from a morale. That's my big soapbox topic is morale. Morale goes high when people are getting things done and they feel like they can get things done. Morale is very low if you can't get things done and you don't know where to turn. So you're helping out with all that. But if you would just riff off that for a minute.
Well, I think, if you look at data teams, the morale is definitely low because, they are always under the gun. There are people who expect data to come for their dashboards, for their machine learning and AI models, and for the data products, which are being used by customers externally and internally. And I think, if the data teams had the capability of being able to focus on things that matter the most. And they were able to, make significant effects and positive effects on the overall business. I think, it's possible that you'll have a lot more productivity from the data team. Obviously, they need tools and technologies to support them. Um, as far as, let me just, break down this topic and talk a little bit about, FinOps. I think if you were thinking about, let's say, identifying the most expensive queries, and, cost is a problem that, pretty much everybody talks about. The CFOs are sharpening their pencils on the IT budget today. The most important thing that you want to find out is that, can you have a conversation with the metadata that you've collected about the cost from a, show back and chargeback perspective from a departmental basis, because you rolled out a piece of technology to everyone. The capability of you going and having a conversation as opposed to a technical deep dive, I think there's like a subtlety to it, which, we can explore at length, and why that becomes really important. But that is one of the biggest problems that, data teams face today. That, they don't know why this expense graph is going up and up and up, and why the CFO is shouting down, at them, because there's no reason that they're not guilty, but there's a bunch of users who are using technologies in the way that they were ideally not supposed to. But did they have access to the best practices? Did they have the capability of going and asking, okay, here's the intent, and can you recommend a query that I should be writing or reusing? And I don't think, people have that capability today. Um, you also made a very, very important point, that there are copies of data, everywhere. For example, if you're thinking about the entire landscape of data, user is the inviolable source of truth, but user is not just a user. You're embellishing that for marketing purposes. You're embellishing the same user for sales and the same user for customer service. And unfortunately, a lot of those facts are not connected. So when people are trying to, put all of these information pieces together, they end up creating more copies of data than less. They end up using more non-authoritative sources than the authoritative sources and the sources that have accurate data. And what it does is that it just continues to put more pressure on the data team to identify the right sources, to figure out, okay, should this be used or should this not be used? And what's the cost of, maintaining that data asset? A lot of data assets, they're just lying down idle. 60 to 70% of the data warehouse in some cases may not have been used in the last, 3 months or 6 months.
Yeah, and so from a cost perspective, I mean, obviously, anytime you're transacting in the cloud, you're incurring compute costs. Storage costs are much lower than they used to be, so that's not nearly as
Mhm.
dire a problem. But it does get to be, it kind of creeps up even with observability data, right? I mean, there's a company we did some work with, Mesmo, which orchestrates and routes your observability data such that you don't persist unnecessarily and thus save
Yeah.
time. I thought that was a pretty interesting moment in the evolution of observability, that you already have a meta vendor sitting on top helping you orchestrate all the or data observability data that you're getting. So maybe just explain a little bit more how that saves you money. Is it mostly in the compute? Is it in the compute and the storage and the process? Or but maybe just explain that a bit.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting space. So, what you were referring to was basically the optimization of the observability data from an ingress and egress point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was referring to was the end user, analytics, or, end user ML and AI, or models using, more of data for processing. And both of these are extremely expensive operations. I think everybody knows that egress costs are really high as far as cloud is concerned. And obviously data volumes, and the storage cost on the cloud has dramatically gone down. That said, if you're using an ISV tool, for example, the most popular data warehouses of today, or if you're using CSP services to query the data that you've collected from your business, it's really important that you query them appropriately. And they're like, it's not a technology problem as such, because the technology is capable of running a SQL query on petabyte scale, because that's what the technology was built for. The real question is, does the business need that? And can people optimize the amount of information that they're looking at? And that's where, FinOps and practices of FinOps become really important. Like, are you auditing your queries on a regular basis to find out that were they written for the current state of the world? Because if you wrote a query which said select star from table customer when you had 10 customers, that reality of the world changes very quickly when you have, let's say, hundreds of millions of customers. So, how quickly are you able to adopt to the new realities of the world, and are you able to optimize the access patterns of the users and getting them the right information without unnecessarily running the compute engines and incurring cost? Are you able to put the right guardrails from a departmental perspective, which says that, you had $1 million to spend and you are at about, 575,000 this month, and we're in the fourth month. Do they get proactive alerts so that they can go and audit all their queries and automatically get recommendations that, look, this is not the data that you're regularly using. Here is a better query, and here is a possible query that you can use. You lose fidelity, but you'll still get most of the information that you're looking for. And is your business use case looking for fidelity, or is it looking for broad numbers and roll-ups? So depending upon that, you can then figure out that, look, these utilization patterns, these access patterns, they don't make sense. It's a case of overreach. And every time that you're writing a more complex query, mind you, cloud is elastic, but it's going to cost you, and it costs a lot. We've had, scenarios in which we've seen people write queries on ISV services on the cloud, which have gone and cost them like $60,000. And, these are pretty expensive operations. So the sooner you get ahead of those problems, the sooner you're able to apply controls, get recommendations on, what are better tables and better sources to use, what are the better queries to write, what are the alerts that you should be watching out for, it then allows you to manage your cost really well. Otherwise, you're always upgrading your contracts. Hey, Eric, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Rarely happens. My dog was barking. But I want to ask you a bit of a curveball question here because I'm listening to what you're talking about, what you're able to do, and I'm wondering, lots of people are trying to figure out, do we have the best infrastructure? Do we have the best setup to serve our business needs? Are you able to, and you don't have to name any names here, but are you able to ascertain, look at a particular client environment and say, okay, you guys are using X technology now. We think actually for your use cases and for your topography and for your business needs, Y would probably be better for these various reasons. Is that something you're able to do?
Look, I think, this is a very, very, it's a team specific question and an enterprise specific question. The enterprise architecture review board meets and decides on a certain set of technology based on, the fidelity of data that they're collecting and the cardinality of data sets that they have and the rate at which they want to extricate information out of that. And while we know in certain use cases why certain choices are made, it's hard for us to just come and purely from a tech perspective recommend that, if you went to that tech, you're going to get, 10x better performance. I think you could do that, but it will still be without the context. So the question is, what is the context? Under what circumstances were these data warehouses chosen, or data technologies, or ETL pipelines technologies were chosen? I think, there's like a lot of history and also the capability of the team, the preferences of the team that has to work on it because they are skilled in a certain way. And so while we can recommend from a cost perspective, from a large Fortune 500 or a Global 2000 perspective, it also is so much about, reskilling the team, going through the procurement cycle, bringing a new technology. It's not easy. So, the way that we think about it is that, and I always go back to the comment that Jeff Bezos had made, I think in 2017, that the age of, use case specific purpose-built databases is on. The age of, a single database is over. Our view is very simple that, you are going to use the best database for the use case that you're trying to, fix. For example, if you're on, you're trying to use caches, Redis is a great choice. If you're trying to use search, Elastic is a great choice. And if you're using, for example, large storage on your on-premise databases, then HDFS is a great choice. So it's very hard for companies and enterprise and data teams to centralize on one because more islands are getting created, and more use cases will have to be served in the future. So I think net of it, if I were to summarize, I think teams will have to be prepared to manage more technologies.
Hmm. Yeah, it's getting harder by the day. And here's another curveball question for you. Iceberg is taking the data world by storm. And
Mhm.
it's really quite exciting to see this. How big a deal is Iceberg from your perspective, from the clients that you work with? What does it enable? I mean, obviously, the ability to work with much larger data sets with much less friction. What are your thoughts on that innovation and how it changes the data landscape?
I think it's amazing. My personal opinion is that it is really, really great. And the reasons are very simple. First of all, it allows everybody to interop with each other. One of the biggest problems was that, what is the level of abstraction that you're working with? And Parquet was a great invention, about 5, 7 years ago. And then came along Delta. And at some point in time, it almost appeared that, one company was going the Delta way, the other company was going Iceberg. But now just look at the adoption of Iceberg overall. I think the efficiencies that it overall brings to, the storage of data and the querying of data, I think is just remarkable. So I think, Iceberg is going to be a format of the future. And we completely support all of these different formats, all the way from ORC, Parquet, Iceberg, Delta, native S3, if you have something like a menu in between because you're using it for S3 access, we don't care. We support all of these formats, but absolutely, I agree with you. From an interop perspective, Iceberg is going to have some consequential effect on the data industry.
Yeah, and allow people to use different kinds of data sets, allow greater collaboration. I mean, also, of course, with Snowflake, you're seeing stable edges and what were they calling them? Like agile edges or something. A lot of data sharing going on. Is that something that you can see into as well? Like on the Snowflake platform, when two companies agree to share data, are you able to monitor that kind of activity and offer alerts on that?
So we work with a lot of data providers who are using, Snowflake for data sharing. And the way that we work with those data providers is before they supply or they provide their data sets onto the marketplace from which, other companies are taking that data away either through, some kind of FTP or API access or SQL-based access. Um, we are able to ascertain the quality of that data because as this data gets or these data sets get prepared for commercial utilization, the quality of that data has to be super high. So we actually help companies clean up their data before they actually bring it to the marketplace for sharing. So that's the context that we work in, which is again shifting left and before the data sets are offered for commercial utilization, we're already there.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Shift left, move it further upstream so you have fewer downstream problems. It's we're doing a webinar next week, in fact, about shift left with a company called That Dot, and they're doing some interesting things in the streaming graph space. But folks, our next break is coming up here. Once again, talking to Rohit Chowdhury. He is the co-founder and CEO of Accel Data. That's ACCEL data.com. Look those folks up. One segment coming up, we're going to ask them maybe some more curveball questions. We'll see what's going on here. But folks, don't touch that dial. I'll be right back. You are listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio talking to Rohit Chowdhury. He's got to go to get an airport trip done here to fly somewhere. So we want to bang through this final segment. Rohit, I mean, you are squarely in the data space, the provisioning space, the quality space, access, really understanding what's happening and greasing the tracks and giving visibility to companies to be able to do all these fun things. Because without visibility, you could have some pretty unfortunate things happen in your data world. What's your advice for CDOs who are looking at this just panoply of players and data and activities? How do they slow down and make sure they're making the right decisions?
I have a few suggestions. First of all, I would actually recommend highly all the CDOs to just take stock, take a step back, and see whether you're going to be ready for the upcoming AI world. I think a lot of good decisions can be made if you start thinking about the future and act according to a target state architecture that you're thinking about. And when you actually have the target state architecture in your mind, you can do a few things. You can sort of go and select the right vendors and remove the vendors that are not working for you today and kind of things that are causing a lot of operational drag. And the third component obviously is that you can then build a really good team um, based on the needs of your future. Now, obviously, it's an idealistic statement to say, okay, go look, 5 years out. And most of the CDOs would shoot me and say, okay, what do I do about the 5 fires that I have today? I think isolating those fires are going to be important because unless you staff and put the right tools and technologies to keep a sustainable system to put fires out, the transformation for the future is going to suffer pretty remarkably. And in the next 3 to 5 years, what you'll end up finding is that you're actually not at the leading or the cutting edge of technology. I think it's also important to find the surface area and start with where the most burning problems are. And we've seen this, time and time again, that self-serve analytics is broken, or, data pipelines have too many failures, and the expectations of either external or internal customers in an enterprise, they're not being met. So I would also, urge, data leaders to go back and look at, the first principles, which is how are your data engineering pipelines set up? How are your data pipelines set up? What technologies did you use? Did you put the right checks and balances? Are you looking at it enough, and do you have an operational cockpit through which you can run the entire ship? Because if you don't have that, I think that becomes difficult. So from our perspective, when we go into an enterprise, we tell them, okay, let's actually take a state of the union check. Let's look at, what you have, how is that performing, and then we can come to solutions. But let's actually try to frame the problem first in the right way so that we're looking at the right solutions as opposed to, solving world hunger.
Hmm. Yeah, you have to be very practical and pragmatic. And I guess that was a question I was asking you earlier is when you first come into a client engagement, obviously you're going to be testing to find baseline. What is happening? So we understand what is normal. Once you understand what is normal, then you can start
Yeah.
looking for alerts. What are some of the things that you find when you go on site? What are some of the things that kind of stand out to you as, oh, this is a red flag or this is a green flag. This is going very well. What do you look for in terms of metrics or numbers or tangible topics to discuss with the client?
Well, what has, for example, been the growth of your spend on an ISV data warehouse technology, and how has that been growing over a period of time? When was the last time that you took stock of, let's say, your on-premise data logs, and when was that last cleaned up? How many temporary tables do you create on a daily basis? In some cases, we go and find out what's the cycle time for you to run data quality checks on your most important data processing, pipelines and commercially available data sets, for example. And the answers that we've gotten have been, extremely surprising. We found out that, a leading data company could run their data quality checks only once in 30 days, and that was putting them out of compliance.
Hmm.
I mean, this day and age, this has to be in real time. It cannot be, greater than 4 hours at a time. So finding some of those things, displaying and putting the information in front of the data leaders, it just opens their whole, mind to a different possibility. Um,
Hmm.
but there have been like enough and more surprises that I've found, and some of it we can talk, some of it we can't.
Yeah. Well, you hit on the compliance issue too, just being able to monitor things. I mean, I've always believed that if an auditor does come knocking on your door, what they're going to want to see is your plan, your data, how you execute, when you find a problem, what you do about it. As long as you've documented your processes and have a meaningful plan, I think you're usually going to be okay. It's when you don't have a plan, it's when you don't have documentation, that's when you're caught flat-footed, and that's a very unpleasant situation, right?
Yeah, and it's a problem because, the implementation of controls, which typically is something that regulators always looking at, is very hard unless you standardize on a platform. Because if you don't have a standard, and if you don't have a common mechanism by which you can expand it from one domain to the other, then it's always a project which has run the course, and people get frustrated, people get tired, the implementation is not there, it becomes really hard. So I think standardizing on certain technology platforms, whether you use data observability or you build something by yourself, doesn't really matter. But I think, people need to get ahead of the controls problem, because it absolutely, in today's day and age where attribution, personalization, and sharing of personal information is such a big deal, it's really important that companies and enterprises get ahead of it.
Yeah. Well, and when you start talking about personalization, now you're weaving in personal information, PII. How do you protect that? What are your policies around that? How do you deliver that efficiently in a timely fashion to the right place at the right time? And all that is a bit dicey. And generative. The real problem with generative, of course, is that it is probabilistic math underneath, and so it's never going to be perfect. That's why you see all these RAG models being used, right, to be able to kind of give anchors of truth to the LLMs, right?
I think so. I think, RAG is going to be great for all of us, including Excel data and the kind of technologies that we are going to bring to our enterprises. But think of it this way: the state of the union keeps changing, and one of the benefits that you have with something like RAG is that it is in tune with the latest state of the union, and that's the most amount of benefit that you can get to all enterprises. Because what's been the problem? The problem from a governance standpoint, and which is something that I've been talking about for a long time, that the two worlds, which is data governance and data engineering, they have to come together. And I think that data management overall is in for displacement. I also think that AI is going to play a huge role, because a lot of the traditional hard things are going to become significantly easier to implement and significantly easier to roll out. And I think the whole technology change has been a massive boon for all of us.
Interesting times, I can say that. Well, I guarantee for sure that any data intensive company is going to need some kind of observability solution. So I definitely would recommend folks check these guys out. Accel Data, ACCEL data.com. Rohit Chowdhury, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate your expertise. You've been on the cutting edge for a while now. So good luck to you. And folks, we'll talk to you next time. You've been listening to DM Radio.
Thanks, Eric.